All right, we are live. Good morning, Lee.
Good morning. Good to see you, Chris.
You too. I'm just up the road from you in North Carolina. Decided to come out to your side of the world.
Well, this is a good country. All sides are good.
Yeah, I grew up in Virginia, so I drove through my home state for the first time in a long time the other day, so it was nice.
Good.
Well, cool. We'll give folks about a minute or so to join, and then we'll dive in. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. My name's Chris Hare, the host of the Storied Future podcast, and my vision and what I'm building is really a storytelling platform where veterans and business leaders can come together and tell their stories, own their narratives, right, rewrite their narratives if needed, in ways that can transform them and really shift the future for them. Um, it's really my belief that when we tell our stories, it has the power to change us, to change others, and to change the world. And there are few people better to tell that story to help us understand that than Lee Ellis. So Lee is a president of Leading with Honor. It's a leadership and team development training and coaching company. He serves Fortune 500 senior executives in the areas of hiring, team building, human performance, and succession planning. As a fighter pilot in Vietnam, he was shot down, captured, and repatriated in 1973 after more than 5 years as a POW in Hanoi. He resumed his Air Force career, eventually retiring as a colonel. After his military retirement, he's worked almost 40 years as an educator, researcher, and developer, leadership coach and trainer, and award-winning author and professional speaker and spokesman for Leading with Honor. Lee has authored 7 books, and his latest best-selling book is entitled Captured by Love, Inspiring True Romance Stories from Vietnam POWs, and you can learn more at leadingwithhonor.com. Lee, it's an honor to have you. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much. I've been very blessed
Yeah, it's
to be
been,
here.
was introduced to you earlier this year, I believe by Jamie Minton, and just been an absolute blessing to meet you, to learn from you, to learn from your story, and excited for folks to hear from you today. So a bit of housekeeping for folks that are tuning in. I'm going to interview Lee for around 45 to 60 minutes. And then we're going to have a few folks on to share. A part of what I do with these storytelling experiences is my hope is that it's just as inspirational and is also transformative for the guests as much as for the audience. And so we're going to have on a couple of folks towards the end who will just reflect back on what they've heard from Lee and his story. And then we're also going to have feel free to hit the comments and add questions. And we're going to do some Q&A time at the end. And I think that's it. So, Lee, let's jump in. To start out, I'd love to understand how you would describe who you are without talking about what you've done or what your journey's been. So, really, at the identity level.
Well, I grew up in a good home on a farm in Georgia. Uh, I learned to plow mules, but I always wanted to fly. And so I was not the best student in school, but I scored the highest on the SAT that we took my junior year. But I was the worst student that probably ever graduated in 4 years from college. But I was the distinguished graduate of our Air Force ROTC because I was one step short of ADD. Some people would say I'm ADD, but I feel like I'm one step short. And I would just focus on this, and I wouldn't focus on studying a lot. I would just study enough to pass, that was all I cared about. And you know, and later I learned to do something different. That was a real advantage of being a long-term POW because we learned to focus and to think it through and plan for it and to um, to just do something different in a different way and to manage our lives more differently.
Well, take me back. Where were you born? Tell me about growing up, and I'd love to understand too what you were like as a kid. What were you into? What was play like for you? What brought you joy?
Well, I grew up on the farm, and I loved to. We
And you're
hunted rabbit.
Georgia boy, right?
Yeah, Georgia, North Georgia, and it was kind of hilly there. It wasn't really good farmland, but we grew cotton and corn and wheat and oats and baled hay and that sort of stuff. And I also started driving when I was 11 years old. My brother, who was 2 years older, 2.5 years older than me, he didn't drive till 15. And so, but I always wanted to drive, and my dad let me drive and taught me to drive. And I started driving tractors and trucks when I was 12. And so I just always wanted to do things that were uh, kind of in control of it,
Mm-hmm.
you know. That's why I became a fighter pilot. But my family went down to Athens, Georgia, where the University of Georgia is, 10 miles away, and we went down on a picnic at the Veterans Park there. And when I was 5 or 6 years old, and my dad, there was a World War II fighter plane there, and my dad picked me up sat me on the wing. It was on a pedestal, and he sat me on the wing. And I went over and looked in the cockpit, and I thought, this is me.
Hmm.
And I never forgot that. I just always wanted to be a pilot. And so when I was plowing mules, I was looking up and during the Korean War, I was looking up to lots of airplanes were coming over as they were getting ready to go into Korea over there. And so I farmed and I played. I lettered in 4 sports. As Commerce High School was a small town, and I played 4 sports. I played quarterback and defensive cornerback on defense. Uh, I played basketball. I ran track, and I played baseball. I played center field, and so I just had loved sports, but I was only 155 pounds, 5'8.5", 5'9", and 155 pounds when I was a senior. And I had a couple of offers for part-time scholarship, partial scholarships to small schools. And I said, no, I got to go to Georgia and did that. And I'd always hoped I'd get a scholarship to University of Georgia because my mother's brother played football there in the 1920s, and his sons played on scholarship and football scholarship in the 1950s. And I went to see them practice all the time, and I went to every Georgia game from the time I was in the 6th grade on up, you know. So I had to settle for that I wasn't going to play football in college or the pros. And so I became focused on being a fighter pilot.
Well, I don't want to gloss over the fact of working mules because there's not very many people who have done that. I had to chop peanuts for, a couple months when I was a teenager, but that's about the closest I got to farming. But I'm curious for you, what was that like even, and then take me to that moment too when you saw that plane fly over.
Well, it was kind of boring, going back and forth on rows. You go to the end of the row and turn around and come back and go to the end of the row. And that was not me. I would let the mule rest up and I would go do something else. I'd tie him up and go do something else and for 20 minutes and come back and start again. And I was picking cotton, and I was not a good cotton picker. Most of my friends who grew up on farms were real cotton pickers, and they could pick 200 pounds a day, and I could only pick about 125 or so, 140, and just leaning over, picking those cottons and putting them in your bag. And that's when I knew that I was not going to be a farmer. I loved being on the farm, but I was not going to be a farmer because I love the outdoors. You know, I started hunting and dove shooting and quail shooting and rabbit hunting and all that when I was a kid, and I love that. But you know, I just didn't want to farm doing that. I love to be outdoors, but I didn't want to do plowing a mule, and that was I could do that, but I just wanted to drive a tractor.
Yep.
And
I get
then I
that.
wanted to fly a jet. You know, people have been plowing oxen and mules for thousands of years. And I went from doing that to flying a supersonic jet in 10 years. So I was born at a really unique time.
That's crazy. Well, yeah. So it's like, take me there then. How did you, your path through college, and then how did you ultimately end up joining the Air Force?
Yeah, I was finished my last class in college in July. I had to go one more class to because I changed majors when I got in our advanced ROTC. I changed majors, and so I had to go take one more class in the summer of 1965, and I finished it up in July the 23rd. And I went to the Air Force ROTC unit, and my family was there, my mother and father, and they commissioned me, pinned me on as a second lieutenant. And 3 days later, I had an assignment in Moody Air Force Base to fly T 38s.
Hmm.
And 3 days after I finished college, I was in flight school and I loved it. And I just found it to be very easy. And a lot of guys were struggling with it, but I had downgraded on one time on an instrument approach in the T-38, but everything was really good after more than that, aside from that. And when I got my wings, when my class graduated, uh, 56 weeks later, in August of 1966, the first week of August, the war in Southeast Asia was building up. And so over half my class got an assignment that said F4 Phantom Pipeline Southeast Asia. And so we got to we were going to combat training right away, SEER school, and taking off to go to Southeast Asia. We went to the Air Force guys, went to the Philippines, to Clark Air Base, and went through jungle survival for 4 or 5 days. And then we went over to Vietnam or Ubon, Thailand, or the Thailand. There are 3 bases in Thailand and 3 or 4 air bases in South Vietnam. And that's where we went.
So we'll come back there in a second. I don't want to skip over too much I would love to hear about your first solo, right? Because you went from running a mule to all of a sudden this is the dream, right? What did that feel like for you? Or your first time flying, either one?
It just felt like it's what I did.
Yep. It was
You
amazing.
know, I just felt good about it. I felt really good about it, but it was just something I was always designed to do, and I just wanted to do more of it and get to do it better and to take on more and more uh, parts of it. You know, instrument flying and formation flying and combat flying and whatever.
Well, take me back then to Asia then and then how you ultimately ended up going to Vietnam.
Do what now? What was that question?
Oh, I just wanted to fast forward back
Yeah,
to then
yeah.
when you got to Vietnam and how that transpired.
Well, I had a Lance Sijon, who's a Medal of Honor, the only Medal of Honor winner from the Air Force Academy. He was my buddy, and we'd played golf together, going through combat training, and dated together, chased girls together, all that stuff. And he was a great guy. And we had assignment to Ubon, Thailand. When we got to the Philippines, they changed it. They needed to send some people to Da Nang, and he and I both went to Da Nang. and I was shot down on the 7th of November, 1967, and he went down the 9th. And
So how many missions did you fly before that?
okay, I got over there in July of 1967, and I had 53 missions. By November the 7th, I had 53 over the north, and some over, 10 or 15 over South Vietnam, flying close air support to support the Army in I Corps in the northern part of South Vietnam and the Marines there. And we did some in Laos to stop up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which had come down to the barrier to the between North and South Vietnam, and they would go over to Laos and go down the side there to get to South Vietnam to get down towards Saigon and that sort of thing. And so we were flying missions over there to blow up the road and blow up trucks and that sort of thing. But I had 53 over the north, and we got shot at on most every mission. A lot of times we came back and had bullet holes in our airplane. We didn't know that we were getting shot at. We could see that we were getting shot at because they're about one every 10 an aircraft machine gun or cannon has about, and the same is true in airplanes, about one out of every 8 or 10 bullets has it's shiny. It's shiny so you can, the pilot or the shooter can see where it's going.
Tracer.
Okay. And so we saw those illuminated bullets almost every flight we took on North Vietnam, but not always in Laos and not always in South Vietnam.
So tell me about that then in terms of the mindset as you're going through those missions and you're getting shot at regularly. Was there, in your mind, was there a feeling of like, hey, this is going pretty well, I'm going to make it through this without anything going sideways, or what was going on in your head?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what that sound was.
Yeah,
but
I don't know either.
we were just focused on doing our mission, and if we saw something coming, we didn't usually try to avoid it, but we tried to roll in from a place where they wouldn't see us coming, and they wouldn't see us until the last minute or so, or last second or so. And so, but we just had to do our mission. We had to drop the bombs. And when I was shot down, we rolled in. Ken Fisher and I rolled in. We were two pilots in the F4. The Marine Corps and the Navy had an weapons systems officer in the back seat. They didn't have pilots, but in the Air Force, we had two pilots in the early days, in the early years. And so when we rolled in, there was a good bit of shooting at us. And so we rolled around and rolled over and came back down and kept aiming at the target. And when we pickled the bombs, 750-pound bombs, to blow up this anti-aircraft site, that our airplane blew up with less than 2 seconds. And our airplane blew up, and it was just blown up and tumbling end over end. And that was, we were doing about 450 miles an hour at that point. And so, we just had to figure out what was going on and get out of there. We just had to get out because we knew that was going to crash. The airplane, the canopy, the cockpit was intact, and it was going to hit the ground in about 15 seconds. And so I just pulled the handle and ejected and everything worked. And I was looked up at my parachute, and he pulled the handle, and he ejected, and was a little bit lower. He tried a little bit longer because we were bumping from positive G's to negative G's. And when I first tried to eject, I was had negative G's and my head was up against the canopy. And I said, I got to wait a second and see. And then all of a sudden it became positive and I pulled the handle.
Hmm.
And that was really good because I didn't have any real injuries. I had some cut places in my, and my head was really strained. My neck was really strained because I had 18 G's on it going out going out of there. And so, but I didn't notice all that. I was just coming down in my parachute, and they were shooting at our wingman. They were shooting at us, maybe. I just didn't know that. And I just did a parachute landing fall. I hit perfect, all 5 points. And then I jumped down into a bomb crater, an old bomb crater there. It was about 3 or 4 feet deep. And I jumped in it and pulled out my radio, and I said, this is Buckshot 2 Bravo. I'm on the ground. I'm about to head south to the river. I was only 200 meters north of the river. I said, I'm about to head south to the river. Start strafing at 300 feet, 300 meters. And 7 years later, 2 years after I came home, we had a fighter pilot reunion down in San Antonio. And my wingman came up and said, I heard your call, but I couldn't shoot that good. I didn't want to hit you. They were only 100 meters away from you when you got captured, when you came down. And I said, yep, that's right. I'm so glad you didn't shoot because you might have hit me. So they captured me within 2 minutes.
Wow. And so, do you recall what your response, internally, whether if it was fear or, oh boy, here we go, or what were you feeling in that moment?
Well, when they came out, 2 or 3 of them came out of the bushes there. There was no tall trees. There was bushes. It was kind of a flood zone, and I was only 200 meters north of the river, and there was kind of a flood zone there. And 2 of them stepped out, and they were militia guys. And I said, well, I'll scare them away. And I had a 38 revolver with 2 rounds of tracer. And I pulled it out and shot over the head 1 round of tracer to scare them away. And they didn't flinch. And another one stepped out with an AK-46, which is a Vietnamese gun, and automatic. And one of them pulled out a piece of paper that said, pulled out and unfolded it, and he said it was phonetic, Vietnamese phonetics on one side, and it had a picture of a guy with a pilot with his helmet on with the hands up, and he said, hands up, surrender, no die, surrender, no die. And I thought, that's probably good advice. So I just put my hands up and surrendered, and they stripped me down to my underwear and gave me my flight suit back. But they had a hard time getting my G suit off, and I had a vest on with a lot of stuff in it, and they didn't know how to unzip things, and they just cut it off.
So where did they take you initially, and then maybe kind of walk me through just the process and where you were moved to over time?
So I was going back to what your other question was, is I was just kind of almost not thinking. I was just in shock, okay, for the first 2 or 3 minutes. And then they tied me up and tied my hands behind my back and put a rope around my neck to lead me along like a dog. It was about 4-foot rope, 5-foot rope, and they lead me along, and they put a blindfold on me, and they took me away and started moving me away. And I figured I'm still alive and I'm going to hang on.
Hmm.
I'm going to hang on. Now, what was your second question?
Oh, just in terms of what was the progression like in terms of where they took you, and
Yeah.
then when you met up with other folks who had been captured and that sort of thing.
Well, they were taking me to a village, a little bitty village nearby, and to report in with me, I think, to the militia there. And they were dragging me along, pulling me along, and there's four guys, I think, and one of them was in charge, and they pulled me up, and I could see underneath that blindfold, I could see where I was stepping, and I saw a ditch in front of me, and I remember the story of Korean captured people being taken out to the back of the village, and there was a ditch, and they shot them and covered them up. And I thought that was what was going to happen to me for a second. And so I stopped and I spun around and looked under my blindfold at the guy who was in charge, and he was up like this. And they started yelling at me, and I thought he was going to shoot me, and I didn't want to shoot me in the back. And so they spun me around again, and I spun around again and faced him. And they started screaming, and they jerked me around and kicked me in the butt. And I jumped over that little ditch. It was about 2 feet wide. And they jumped over too and started giggling and laughing. And I knew they weren't going to shoot me then. I thought they were going to shoot me down before. And so they took me on to the next village, and they found out that there was trucks coming down sometime, and they were going to have to wait for a couple of days for the trucks to come back to go north to take me to Hanoi. And
Lee,
so
we just had a question come in from Teresa Merlino. She asked, what happened to your co-pilot? Was he right with you the whole time, or?
Well, he was about a quarter mile away, a half mile away. Because he jumped out about 3 seconds behind me, and that's where it was. And they caught him. The militia caught him before he did his parachute landing fall. They caught him as he was coming down and hitting the ground in his parachute, and they caught him and captured him. And after they gave me my flight suit back, they blindfolded me and put me in that rope, and they took me into about a mile away, and they put me in an underground bomb shelter they had built, and I heard somebody breathing in there, and I said, "Ken, is that you?" And he said, "Yeah." "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." And we were only in there for about 3 minutes, and they came in and took me out and took me away. Now, he went on to the halfway house, which was a prison, been made into a prison about up near Venn, which was about several hours away. It was only about 200 miles away, but it was several hours away. And they took me back to another village, and I slept there that night. I tied up, and the next day, they took me out, and I slept with 3 or 4 militia in a ditch for 2 nights. And then one guy was put in charge to take me north, and that was an amazing experience. He was really a good guy. He would not let them. He was a militia guy, and he would not let them beat me up. Or let the local people or the communists beat me up. and a lot of guys got beat up and really bad when they were captured, but he would not let them beat me up. And I spent 2 or 3 nights in his underground shelter with his father and his wife and a 2-year old. I found out 2 years ago was a girl. I thought it was a boy, and I slept on the ground in this underground cave that dug it into the uh, to the sand dunes on the Gulf of Tonkin, and they had gone in this big sand dune hill, and they dug it in and built a, because they didn't want to live in their home because it might be blown up or something. But it was amazing. They fed me and took care of me, and then we moved on up to uh, the drop off at the halfway uh, house, the prison up there.
Real quick, you talked about the fact that you didn't realize until 2 years ago um, about the kid. Did you reunite with them?
Well, fighter pilots have been over there. A lot of the Thunderbird uh, F-100 Thunderbird or F-100 pilots have been back, and they were flying up there as our controllers up there, and so they have been back into Route Package One, which is just to the north of the DMZ. That's where they were flying every day, and they were Misty pilots. Okay, and that's what they were called. And there's some really famous ones there, but some of them have been back and took tours. And a guy from Dong Hoi, which is near when I was captured, has been their tour guide, and he's a really nice guy. And his wife runs a hotel in Dong Hoi. It's a little town there, and he's a tour guide. And they've been back, and he had that. So, I was talking to one of the Misty guys who had been back, and he said, "Well, where were you captured?" And I said, "There." And he said, "Well, I'm going to talk to the guy who's our tour guide and get him to get in touch with you." And he called me on Facebook. This guy was about 55 or 60. He called me on Facebook and talked to me. And he said, "Where were you shot down?" And I said, and he said, "Okay, I know two places." And he said, "It was this one or this one." And I said, "It wasn't that one, it was this one." And he said, "I know the guy. Um, he's dead now, but the guy that was captured you." And he went up and interviewed his wife, and she told him about me being there in their home in their underground uh, dug in place there for 2 or 3 nights.
Wow.
And she said, she described to me, he said he had black hair, and I did back then. And and I had, she said, he's got eyebrows all the way across. And I knew that was me because I did. I had black eyebrows solid all the way across there.
God only
And
gave you one.
he got a video. He interviewed her with a video and sent it to me, and she talked about me uh, and and her husband. He died about 4 years ago. He was a little bit older than I was. He was 80 something, 83 or 84 when he died.
How did that
Amazing, man. It
how
was
did that
amazing.
how did that impact you closing that loop and being able to connect? That's amazing.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful. He was a great guy. He was not a, he was working for the communists, but he had to,
Hmm.
there was a lot of people in North Vietnam that had to work for the communists. Communists always tell lies, a little bit of truth and a lot of lies. So they convinced everybody that we were all taken over and going to come in and throw them out or whatever. And so, but he was a really good guy. And everybody, uh, this guy told me he had interviewed people around there that said he was a great, great man, but he was uh, loyal, but he was a great man.
Hmm. So take me from there to when you were, eventually in prison with, I think it was roughly 55 of you total, but can you talk to me about how you progressed from there to that place?
Well, when we got to Hanoi, uh, sometimes we had been interrogated at the halfway house, and they interrogated Ken Fisher, who's my buddy with my in my airplane, and they hung him up and tortured and tied his arms behind his back and hung him up there to torture him to answer some questions. And when I didn't answer any questions, they had a guard put a AK-46 to the back of my head and say, "If you don't answer the question, we're going to shoot you." And so I gave him 2 or 3 answers, but they were lies. And he had my uh, book plate there, my contents from my capture when I was flying there. And I told him I was flying an F4 because it had the F4 checklist there. And but I didn't give him any information. And we got to Hanoi 2 weeks after I got captured. We were taken in to interview that night, 4 of us that came on the truck, in the back of the truck, tied up in the back of the truck to Hanoi from the halfway house in the prison there in Ben. And so we were told the English speaker interrogator was a manager. He was really not the interrogator that would torture you, but he was the manager there. He told us, he said, "This prison, not hotel." And that was how he greeted us. He spoke really English. He really learned a lot of synonyms and expressions in English, And so he tried to do that. And he told us we had to obey the camp rules, and there was 12 or 14 rules were on the back of our door in our cell. And so we went into a 6.5 by 7 foot cell for the next 10 months. And that's 6.5 by 7 feet. That's 6 inches longer than my arms there, and 1 foot deeper than that. And so we were in there for 8.5 months, and then we went to Sante. 3 of us did. So there were 4 of us in that cell for 24 hours a day, except when we were being interrogated, and we went out to wash in the wash house out in the yard there, in the camp yard.
What did you think? Talk to me a little bit about hope and how you viewed what was ultimately going to happen when you were there, and like what kept you going, but also what were some of the dark thoughts that hit, I guess.
I think to be a fighter pilot, you got to believe, and you're always one step away from dying. As a fighter pilot, you're really very close. You're flying at 450 to 550 miles an hour on your missions, and you're getting shot at a lot. So we were alive and in good health and not suffering that much with our health. We had some injuries, but we weren't focused on them. And we were in prison, and we didn't know what was going on there because we were in total isolation. We didn't have a wall that joined in another wall. And we were in the Thunderbird of Little Vegas. We named the Hanoi Hilton, and then we named after a lot of our units hallways after the casinos in Las Vegas. So we were in Thunderbird. That was an old casino there, and we didn't have a room joining. It was built for isolation, and so we couldn't really contact anybody from tap code. We had the tap code after about 3 months, but we couldn't tap on the wall to anybody because there was a 18-inch space between ours and the next wall, the next cell. Uh, so we just we just day to day. It was day to day. I said we're going to be out by the summer of '68 because we got there the 21st of November of 1967 in the Hanoi Hilton. I said we're going to be out by the summer of '68 because President Johnson is going to have to end this war because he won't get reelected. Well, he didn't want to run. and uh, and I, in the summer of '68, I said, okay, I'm going to be here another year. And the summer of '69, I said, I'm going to be here 2 more years. Well, you know, it was 3.5. But we started, we just were alive and we just had to keep alive, we just, and later, after we got to Sante, we started exercising more. When we moved out to Sante, 8.5 months after I was captured, and we were there for 2 years, and then in the summer of the fall of 1969, they stopped the torture, and Ho Chi Minh died. Their leader, the communist leader who had formed North Vietnam in early 50s there, when they broke away from France. And we were, I've forgotten what I was saying.
Oh, you're talking about how the torture stopped or slowed down. You were able to exercise
we were,
sort of thing.
We were all tortured in the summer of '68 and '69, in the year of '68 and '69. And Ho Chi Minh died in September of '69, and the new leaders came in October, and they stopped the torture. They called in all the camp commanders, the Vietnamese communist camp commanders, and told them to stop the torture. And they did, except, they could do it every now and then sometimes, but they stopped the torture, and we started getting healthier every day because we started working out and sharing more information. We started communicating more and getting more connected to the other building. And then we moved out they were trying to impress the world how well they were treating us, because the wives back home and families back home, the POW families, missing in action families, were trying to put pressure on them to abide by the Geneva Conventions they had signed that said prisoners would be treated lenient and humanely. And they were torturing us, and they stopped it in 1969. And so they were trying to build a new camp. They really found an old prison camp, army camp that they upgraded and put into a new prison camp, and 205 of us went there in the summer of 1970. And 4 months later, the Sante raid came. They raided the Sante raiders, the Sante camp, and we weren't there. None of them got killed or injured, but within 48 hours, they moved us all back to the Hanoi Hilton, but they put us in large cells that were 16 to 1,800 square feet, and they had 40 to 60 guys in those cells, each one. They had 7 cells there, large cells. And I was in a cell with 55 guys for almost the next 2 years. And so we got organized, we got healthy, we weren't being tortured, the food was a little better, and we got classes started. We had Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday classes for 2 months, and we'd take 2 weeks off. We went 3 hours in the morning, and 2 hours in the afternoon. And I started speaking Spanish. I never studied Spanish, we got every day we had 3 times a week we had Spanish class, and 2 times a week we had French class. And I started speaking French, and I got fluent in Spanish and French. And we didn't have any books. We just had guys that knew Spanish and French. And I had a 2,000 word vocabulary in German, and we started getting healthy. And we had church every Sunday. We had a choir. We had Toastmasters on Thursday, informal. And at one end of that room, it was a long room, uh, and formal on Saturday night. And sometimes uh, we had guys telling movies, telling South Pacific. Hey, the guy that managed the choir, he was a 105 fighter pilot. He managed the choir, but he was really good at music, and he produced South Pacific. And I tried out for the singing. He said, "Lee, you don't sing very well. You can't stay on chord." And I said, "No, that's right." And so we
There's only
had
50. There's only 55 of us here, and I can't make it in. Come on.
right. And we had talents. We're all air crews, but we had really a lot of talents. And so we had somebody could do everything. One guy in there was a designer and an artistic designer, and he designed a cabin, and he came home when we released, he built it, you know? And so we just had to start thinking. But here's the thing, we got emotionally healthy. We knew that if we went home with anger and bitterness and doubts and fears and shame and guilt, we were going to be still in handcuffs and leg irons. We were going to be tied up. So every day we worked to uh, get healthy. And what was so important about that is relationships in a community. And we learned to listen to everybody. We listened to people, and they were different from us. We were mostly fighter pilots and air crews, but we were all different, and we'd grown up differently. I was in the farm boy, and there's a guy from New York City, Ken Fisher, my teammate, my roommate, 5 years roommate. 5 out of 5.5, he was my roommate. He's 89 now, and he's still going, man. He says, he's had a surgery recently, and he says, I'm going to start hitting balls again, golf balls again next week. So we just got very healthy before we came home,
Well,
emotionally, mentally, and physically. We were doing push-ups and sit-ups, and when we were at Sante, I had never done pull-ups. I played sports, but I had never done a lot of pull-ups. And we went to the wash house, and they had built it there to wash there for us prisoners to go out room by room, cell by cell. And so I looked up and I saw a 2x6 joist up there, and I said, I can jump up and grab it and do a chin up. And I could only do 3 back then because we were still weak a little bit. And I'd never done chin ups a lot. Back then in the 50s, you didn't do chin ups a lot. And so I did 3. And when I left 2 years later, I could do 30 chin ups and 15 pull ups. So we got healthy. But
well, tell
when
me.
we came home, we had lower PTSD than all the combat veterans. This is studies, but done by the psychologists of the Vietnam veterans. And since then, we had lower PTSD than all of those, and we're outliving our peers. Our average age is 86, and 25% of us are 90 or older.
That's extraordinary. Well, yeah. Tell me why you think, when we first talked, you were talking about the importance of storytelling, and you were sharing about how, in this time you're sharing all the good and all the bad from your past, but also kind of working on your internal narratives and getting those right. So tell me more about that.
Um, you had to recognize the things you'd done right and the things you'd done wrong, because you had so much time to reflect back on your past and you remembered everything you'd ever done. I could remember being 4 years old, and uh, it's a lot of memories coming back to you when you're younger, but still you're focused and you're almost in isolation, because you got a lot of time every day to focus and not talk to anybody. And that became our uh, really, it was a lot of healing, because when we sat down and talked with somebody, when we were locked up with somebody, 24 hours a day, he tells a story, and then I like, oh well, and I tell a story. I can outdo him. I was so bad, you know, and I was so good, and he'll tell us something. And so we started sharing a lots of stories, and we had different talents, and we'd grown up, and some of us were born in the 20s. A few senior officers were born in the 20s, a lots in the 30s, and I was the youngest guy in my cell there. I was born in 43, and there was no 5 year to 8 year POW, long term POW, born after 44 or 45. So we uh, we learned a lot from each other as being different, growing up in different places and different times, and mistakes. We all shared the mistakes we'd made, and that really helped. I think you've got to own yourself. You To be healthy, to be a good person, to be confident, to be secure. You've got to own yourself. You got to believe in yourself, but you got to own yourself, your strengths and your struggles, your weaknesses and your mistakes, and be honest about that. And that's where we all became very healthy, because we started doing that. And other people treated us like we were somebody. And even though we made mistakes, and
What
that helped us believe in ourselves.
what was the shift that you saw in all the guys between um, after the torture and then when you all were brought together as the 55? What shift did you see in the group and their mindset over time? Like, how did the torture and the isolation impact everyone? And then how did things kind of get healthier over time? What did you see?
Well, the fact that we could give in to torture, everybody gave in to torture. It really, I was so ashamed when I was tortured and finally filled out a 3-page biography, and everything on it was a lie except my father's first and last name. But I was tied up. They tied me back up when after I'd filled it in the torture room, and I was in a uh, tied up, my hands behind my back, and my feet within leg irons. My legs were in leg irons, and I was blindfolded. And I was laying there crying like a baby, because I was so ashamed I couldn't beat them.
Hmm.
And I got back to my cell, and one guy was already back. He didn't last as long as I did, but Ken Fisher was the New York State wrestling champion in high school, and he was a tough guy, and he wrestled in college, but he came back a couple hours later, and he said, I finally gave in, and I didn't give him anything. And we said we didn't give him anything either. And so, and then we talked to somebody else about a couple of months later, and they said, yeah, we were tortured. We gave in, we filled it out, we bounced back. And we learned that everybody in the camp had been tortured and bounced back,
Hmm.
except for 3 people.
Hmm.
They hadn't been tortured, they had given in.
Hmm.
So it was really it really helped us to know that everybody had been tortured and everybody had given in. Our senior leaders, they took the most torture and were the isolated the most. They were in 4 years of uh, solitary confinement, but we reached out to them sometimes so we could talk to them and they could talk to us. I talked to Robbie Rosner when he was in a cell. He had just come out of 10 months of total darkness. And he said later in his book, he said, I just was going crazy. And I saw him just after he'd come out of that, and he was smiling, and we were writing on our hands. I could see him, and he was about 25 yards away, and he was spelling out letters on his hand, and we communicated for about 6 weeks. He was smiling and just said, "Bounce back, bounce back."
So how about you in that last season with the other 55 or with the 55? How did you change as you were telling your stories, the good and the bad? How were you transformed?
I didn't know that I was being transformed. I was just getting along, loving all these guys and competing with them. We got to play bridge sometimes, and I was competing with them and doing push-ups and walking on my hands back and forth. And I could do more sometimes than some people, but there was a couple of guys in there that were much more agile than me and stronger than me. And, that was just, I became comfortable with myself. I fit in. I can do this. He can do that. He can do that better than I can do. And I can do this better than he can do. But I didn't think of it that way, but I can do this. He can do that, we just became healthy. And so we stayed together. We've been together now 52 years. We've gone to reunions and we're connected,
Well, tell me about freedom and the moment you found that you were going to get out and what transpired then.
Well, we had been thinking when the bombing stopped in the end of December, and we didn't find out about it until the second week of January. And they brought us, half of us had been put on the Chinese border in the last 8 months, for the last 8 months. When they started bombing up there again in May, down in South in May, half of us were put on the Chinese border. I guess they put us away to hide us out in case Hanoi got bombed up. And so we came back to Hanoi, and they put us in different camps according to the shoot down date. And they told us when the agreement was signed in January the 23rd of 1973, the Paris Peace Accord agreement was signed in January 73. They had 48 hours to tell us that we were going to be released in the next 60 days. And they called us all out in the compound. We were in a group that was all captured in the fall of 67 and early 68. And John McCain was in that group, and I was, and a lot of the guys I knew there. And so they read it to us, and we didn't jump up and down because we didn't clap, we didn't smile, we just walked away and started talking, because if we had smiled and clapped and cheered, they would have taken pictures of it and said, their POWs are so glad we won. We knew that they would use that for communists always lie. They take a picture of something and they lie about it to convince people. And so we just walked back to our cells and walked around the courtyard and talked about it. And we said, well, we'll see. We'll wait, we'll see. And so The first group came out. That was in January the 25th when they read that to us. And the first group came out on February the 14th, 73. And the next group came out February 28th. And I was in the third group that came out March 14th. And the last group came out uh, uh, March the 30th or 31st.
And tell me about coming home.
Well, we got new clothes and shoes and socks that we hadn't worn shoes and socks in 5.5 to 8 years. And so we got clothes and we went back to Clark Air Base in the Philippines on 141. And they did a 24 hours of medical health and 2 days of medical health and examinations and mental health examinations. And we got on the airplane and flew back to our nearest base with a large hospital nearest to our home. And I went back to Montgomery, Alabama to Maxwell Air Force Base. And my parents were there, and mom and dad were there, and my brother and his wife and 2-year-old son were there, 3-year-old son were there. And so we had a visit with them, great visit with them. They met me at the airplane, landed, and they put us in a car, and we drove back to the BOQ and quarters and spent the time there. And my family went home about 3 days later, and I spent 2 weeks there to get deep medical exams and mental exams and debrief all the intelligence. I spent probably 10 hours debriefing on what had happened. Everybody did that. They had somebody there to record a debrief, and they would ask us everything, and we debriefed on that. And that's still top secret now. Those debriefs. I had to go up there when I wrote my book, Leading with Honor. I went up there in 2010 or 2011 to research what I'd said, and I remembered most all of it. But I went back, and we took 2 or 3 months of leave, and my family, I stayed with my family, but I started dating. I was single. The married guys came home with their families, and some of them, they've been 6, 7, 8 years. Their wives said, "Hey, I'm divorced. I got a divorce. I met another guy. You were gone a long time." And a lot of them were stayed married, and I was single. And by the way, the divorce guys, I Captured by Love, that book I wrote a couple of years ago, I have stories in them about they met a widow or they met somebody. They got married pretty soon, and they've been married over 50 years. And I was single, and I was the last single guy to get married, I think. And I got married. I met Mary 14 months later, and we got married 5 or 6 months after that. I met her, and we've been married 51 years and 2 weeks.
That's
We'll
beautiful.
be married 51 years in a couple of weeks. Yeah.
So looking back, you went through a lot of pain. There was a lot of, there was lots of sparks of joy and beauty that happened in the middle of pain and captivity. I'm curious how that kind of shaped the rest of your trajectory, and then also if things from the past, the pain and dark memories and things, how they've impacted you over time.
Well, because of what the wives did, we had the torture stopped, and we had time to get healthy, mentally, emotionally, physically healthy. And when we came home, we were ready to go. And we've looked back. We can talk about, most of us can talk about it as day to day. We don't have any bitterness and anger, and we may hate the Communist Party, but we don't hate the Vietnamese. We have a lot of good friends that are Vietnamese, from South Vietnam and North Vietnam. So we have been very healthy. We're outliving our peers. Our average age is 86. We have lower PTSD than all the other veterans. And so we've had great careers, great marriages, and we've had happy lives. Our average age is 86. So, you know, we stayed positive. And I think it's, Harvard has studied graduates and what makes them the longest living graduates of Harvard school. And they've been studying it for 40 or 50 years. And the ones that live longest have relationships, good relationships. And good relationships is it's a healthy thing. It's when you're in your community, you're going to be connected to others and talking with them and sharing stories with them, and you're going to learn that you're not perfect and they're not perfect, and you make mistakes and they make mistakes, and you're going to feel better about yourself, and they care about you and you care about them, and it's rays of God's love. When you care about somebody, that's a ray of God's love, and they feel uh, special, and they're going to believe in themselves more, and they're going to live longer. Now, some health situations will take people out, and you can't control that. If you inherited some kind of thing, or if you have an accident, a wreck, or something, you're going to do that. But overall, percentage-wise, if you're healthy in relationships, you're going to live longer.
As we're going to move to kind of open it up to a couple interactions, and then we're going to do Q&A after that. So Bill, Jewel, I saw you got a question. We'll circle back to that. But my last question before we do that, Lee, is, as you think back on your life and your mission and all of that, really quick, I should reflect on just the beauty of what you just shared around being in community. Like, that's in my opinion, the most important storytelling is the raw, unscripted, just conversations and reflecting back to each other, because that's how we make meaning of the past. That's how we figure out the present and the future, right? But that importance of those relationships, and how that not only got you all through, but also gave you health on the other side. So thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm curious, as you think towards the future, how do you want to be remembered when you're gone?
Just a good old boy from the country. I don't know. I don't worry about that.
Yep.
I just I want them to remember me as somebody who cared about them.
Yep.
Who would help them, who would hold them accountable. I was a leader. I always cared about people, but I tried to help them become better performers and better person. I really always encouraged them and found ways to help them believe in themselves. But I told them that if they didn't meet their standards, they didn't meet their obligations, they were going to be held accountable. And I think that's very important. And that's one thing is lacking in our country today, with the young people.
Yep.
Most parents are not teaching responsibility and holding them accountable. And our generations did back then. They would spank you.
Oh yeah, that's what I grew up with. I get that one.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, I'm going to open it up. Ted, I'm going to tag you in. Unmute your mic there. And Ted, if you could give just a brief introduction and also your background, because that's important context here.
Yeah, sure thing. And first of all, thank you both, Chris and Colonel Ellis. It's a pleasure to hear your stories, and Chris, your questions. to facilitate some of those insights, which I appreciate a lot, both as a storyteller who has a little bit of experience in strategic communications, but also an executive coach with background in leadership. And I think there's a good amount of intersection between those two elements, leadership and storytelling in particular. But as luck would have it, I also grew up as a fighter pilot, a few generations removed. But I spent some time flying for the Navy, all the aircraft carriers, Tomcats, Hornets, Super Hornets, and enjoyed all of it. And thankfully, never found myself on the end of a bad day like you had, Colonel. So I'm abundantly grateful for that. I've got more than one question for you, Colonel, that sort of came up during your stories. And Chris, I don't know how many
No,
I've
good.
got. Okay,
Fire
cool.
away.
I'll try to answer them quickly.
Oh, well, I'd prefer you just unpack whatever's meaningful to you, no matter how long it takes. But
Yeah, we're not in a rush.
all right, cool. So one of the things that caught my attention when you were telling Chris what was fundamentally important about how you survived your experience as a POW, you talked about living day to day, right? And then you said that you initially sort of clung to this story that, hey, we're going to be out of here by the summer of '68. And when that didn't happen, you revised that, moved the goalposts, so to speak, until stories finally matched up to your liberation. What interests me about that is what Admiral Stockdale reflected on about who didn't survive POW experience in North Vietnam. He said it was the optimists. In particular, he says it was the ones that said, we're going to be out by Christmas, and Christmas will come and go, right?
Let me interrupt.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I have read Stockdale's books and articles, and I have one chapter in my Engage with Honor book on Admiral Stockdale. I really respect him. But that optimism word, he just threw it out, and they put it in there, quoted him in that. And that's good. I know the guy that quoted him in that. And he's a great guy and a great author and a great leadership coach. But Stockdale and Denton were opposites in personality. Denton was an optimist. And they were 7.5-year POWs, Navy commanders when captured. And they were great guys and they were strong guys. But one was an optimist and one was more a stoic. Okay. Stockdale was a stoic, and he had learned that and gone to Stanford and majored in a master's degree and that sort of thing. And there were just different personalities. They were both brilliant and both smart. But I think optimism is misquoted there because the research shows that the POWs survived and returned home so well because of being positive. Now, optimism, you got to be optimistic, but being overly optimistic, Denton said, we're going to go home. He kept saying we're going to go home, but Denton resisted torture. He suffered torture to meet with a Japanese reporter, and he was supposed to tell him, he had finally agreed to tell the Japanese reporter, and they had a video in there, and you can see it online. I have a link to it. When Denton says, he asked him a couple of questions, and he was supposed to say to the question, what do you think about the U.S. Involvement in the U.S. bombing mission of North Vietnam? He was supposed to say, he had agreed to say, and after he'd been tortured, that it's wrong and it's we should stop. And he said that when they asked him that question in front of the camera, Denton said, "Well, I've been here almost 2 years, and I don't know what my country's policy is now, but whatever it is, I agree with it 110%." And they would they let him ask the Japanese reporter, ask him 2 or 3 more questions, and they didn't drag him out right then, but they took him out after 5 minutes and tortured him again. That's how tough Denton was, and Stockdale was too. But Denton was just an optimist. He was always saying, "We're going to go home soon," and they were both in isolation 4.5 years, and both tortured. And Denton came home. He was the first guy off the airplane, and he made a great statement. It's a quote out there now.
Right. I really thanks for unpacking that. I appreciate that, Colonel. And I think it's an interesting question for me about resilience, and perhaps it's worth a deeper look for what your story or your insights offer, what Stockdale and what Viktor Frankl might have said about the survivors of Nazi prisoner war camps. But
optimism at one point is ridiculous. Okay, to believe something that is not going to happen, but believing something that will happen someday, and you put a point on it. When you're committed to resist, survive, and return with honor, that's what our commitment was: resist, survive, return with honor. We were going to bounce back for years, and our leaders really demonstrated that. And we only had a few guys that gave in and really collaborated with the enemy. Oh, very few.
It sounds to me almost like, in both cases, turning back to storytelling, that these are stories that each prisoner is telling themselves, and some of those stories oriented around a calendar and an event might need to have been rewritten, reauthored. But other stories about resilience and surviving and returning with honor and so on and so forth were more foundationally important for those, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah. You got to stay positive. That's what optimism is in the realistic way. Optimism is staying positive and bouncing back and bouncing back. When you suffer, everybody suffers, everybody's going to suffer in life, and you've got to stay positive to your committed mission and your character and your values. You got to stay honored to that, anchored to that.
Colonel, if I could shift to the chapter in your story about when the camp sort of developed structure oriented around church, choir, Toastmasters, learning languages, more things than I knew. How did that come about? You seem to sort of suggest, hey, that we knew this was vital to staying healthy emotionally and physically and all that. But how did you know that? Was it somebody's idea? Was it a collective instinct, or what was that?
Well, my room commander that in that large cell, and he was the Sante commander too. He was the Navy promoted guys earlier to 04 major and lieutenant commander because a lot of them were getting out, and they were just getting. He were promoted about 9 years to 04 lieutenant commander, and the Air Force was promoting majors 04 to at 10 or and a half or 11 years. So, but this guy, Doug Clower, was our room commander, and he called one guy over who had a master's degree and had taught, who was a fighter pilot, but he had been recalled during the Berlin crisis somewhere in the 63 or 4. He was a fighter pilot and got recalled to active duty. And he'd been teaching in community college. And he said, Tom, I want you to build an educational program in here, and you got 2 weeks to do it. I want you to do it in 2 weeks. And Tom thought around and talked to some guys, and we're all 55 guys all elbow to elbow in there in this 1,800 square foot room. And so he talked to some guys, and he found a piece of chalk out in a piece of brick tile that would use as chalk right on the concrete floor. And he went down and put down some on the next to the wall, put down a list of courses we could have. And he said, if you want to teach a course, you've had a major in something, history or geography or French or Spanish or German, come tell me and I'll write it down over here. And then every day around 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, we didn't have a phone or a watch, but late in the afternoon, we would have 5 minutes of silence because 55 guys in there have been talking all day. And so we'd have 5 minutes of silence, and we'd have announcements and birthdays and shoot down days and announcements. And so he got up and made an announcement. He said, okay, guys, I've had Tom Story here in charge of building an education program, and Tom's going to tell you what it is now. And Tom said, okay, I've got courses written down over here that we can have, and I want everybody to take this piece of chalk over here, a piece of brick tile, and mark under what you want to study. And we marked one to study, and then he recruited, for the ones that had the most, he recruited a teacher who was going to be in charge of it, and he told them to go to it. And you can have Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes, or Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday classes, or whatever. And then he recruited somebody to be in charge of Toastmasters. And somebody to be in charge of the, we know who was in charge of the singer was. We knew who that was. We had some songs in there before, and so we put him in charge of the chorus. But you could study music if you wanted to. So in that, we just got organized. Now, some of the rooms didn't have that, but they had something else that they were studying. They were using their time to do something every day.
It's fantastic.
I took differential calculus. One other guy from the Naval Academy guy, a guy that lived across the hall from me in Hanover Hilton, but he was in my cell now, Denver Key, and he graduated in the class of 62 or 3 from the Naval Academy, and he had majored in math. And he taught differential calculus, and took that piece of brick tile, and me and one other guy, we learned that he'd write it out, and he'd explain it, and he'd erase it, and he'd write out another one and erase it and say, okay, write it out. And so you saw this one. We had a good time.
Well, anecdotally, nobody who knew me at the Naval Academy would have ever thought that I would be good in that class. So shifting gears over to leadership, you're involved in that now, right? You're doing leadership work, you're helping to guide leaders and so on. And I'm curious, from a storytelling perspective, what is the most important thing for leaders to know about storytelling?
I think leaders have to know you got to be confident, because you got to share things with people. You got to be so confident that you can share a story, a good story and how you messed up, you know, and that will help them. And you got to listen to them. Start out by listening to them and encouraging them, but listen to them, and then say, well, you know, I did something worse than that. I messed up, you know, and here's what I did, and here's what I learned out of it. And I think you'll learn something out of this too. And the person feels better about themselves. They're more confident, and they're going to be more humble, and they're going to be more secure and be more vulnerable. And that's what great leaders need to be. You know, you can't protect yourself. If you protect yourself from all the stuff that's happened in your life and you're not perfect at, you got to be insecure. And when you're somebody very insecure, people are not going to want to work for you. You're going to be always projecting yourself as being perfect.
I want to reflect a little bit about the negative impacts that you might have seen over the years, either individually or at an organizational level, around internal narratives or storytelling. Have you ever seen those have a negative impact?
Well, if you've never told somebody about you being imperfect and you tell them about how story about how you're perfect, they're going to start wondering about you. You know, you can't pretend to be perfect all the time and tell the story. Now, if somebody tells a story that doesn't apply in this world, in this situation, they're not going to want to listen to it. So my wife tells me sometimes, I don't want to hear that. Why are you telling me that? And I said, well, I talk a lot and I'm just thinking out loud, you know, and if you think out loud, you got to be very careful about being with introverted people. If you're an extrovert, you got to be very careful about talking to introverts because they don't want to hear all that stuff that comes through your mind. And an extrovert typically shares everything that comes in their mind.
So what would you advise any of your young leaders to do in that case?
Coach yourself every day. I'm an old man and I coach myself every day to the things that I need to know and I need to do better. And I need to, in this situation, is very different from this situation. I got to coach myself to operate on this situation. You know, if I'm going to meet somebody and talk to them when they are this and I don't know what they are, I just got to coach myself to say, okay, carefully open this up.
And how do you get that feedback on what you need work on?
Well, I know my personality. You got to know your personality. You got to understand your talents, your strengths, and your struggles. For every talent, if you're a take charge guy, you've got strengths and you've got struggles. Okay. If you're an outgoing guy, you've got strengths, you've got struggles. If you're an introvert, you've got strengths, you've got struggles. You got to know those and understand those and coach yourself to adapt and avoid your struggles.
Fair. Colonel, I've got two more questions for you. They're both about transformation. You've been generous with your time and your storytelling about your experience as a POW. And I'm wondering, how did that POW experience transform you then?
It transformed me a lot. Not my natural talents, I don't think, but it transformed my ability to manage myself. You know, I said earlier, I'm one step short of ADD, and I didn't focus on many things except the things I'm focused on right now. I'm flying an airplane and doing something like that. But I learned to study and think and reflect. That was so important. And I think I became more humble. I don't have to pretend I know everything. I can just say, you're better at this than me. That's very helpful. Clarify that question again.
Well, I think what I heard you say was that your experience as a POW transformed you.
Yes. And I went back to college and to get a master's degree, and I made all A's. I just learned to focus on it.
Right.
Just learn to study, learn to focus. And that's why I've written 6 or 7 books. If you told my mother that I had written a book, she would say he can write a paragraph. She was a school teacher and she loved me very much. But, I was back then, I didn't want to write stuff. I only read one book in high school and grammar school. I only read one book. I didn't read books. I didn't study unless it's something I want to focus on. I'm interested in. I might go study that. I would read about guns and ammunition and hunting and flying.
Right. No, I understand. Okay, so which brings me to my last question about transformation, and more to do with your transformation today. Specifically, how is storytelling or your internal narratives, how are they affecting who you're becoming today?
I want to tell stories that have principles in them that will help people. And something has got to be in there that will help somebody. And so I think about that and what is it I want to tell them. After I wrote my first book, Leading with Honor, Leadership Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, a bunch of my friends said, Lee, when are you going to write a book on accountability? And I said, I don't know. And I researched accountability and started thinking about it. And I wrote the book on courageous accountability, Engage with Honor, creating a culture of courageous accountability. And I think, the leader has to let people know what he expects them or she expects from them and help them get going and help them, let them know that you're going to help them if they want to be helped. And so I just express things that people in the situation they're in, they need to know. What I tell them a story about sometime when this happened or that happened, or when I didn't do this, when I learned this, and show them that story and help them adapt and learn to do things differently, to improve.
Right. And I wonder currently right now, what is it you're focused on improving or changing?
I'm really focused on helping people. I've written several blogs on this, is to believe in yourself. Because when you're insecure, you're going to do dirty work. You can't If you're insecure, you don't have the courage to live with honor and lead with honor and to carry out your assignments and do it the right way, because you're going to protect yourself. You're going to, these politicians that adapt, a lot of them, most politicians are basically good people. Okay. But when they are in a situation when they can see this and you want to hear, I back in 2012, I heard a person on TV say that, well, if he doesn't say he doesn't agree with this, he's going to suffer, and he needs to agree with this. And I said, all of a sudden, I see that politicians need to agree with this, or they're going to take not as get voted for as much, but they got to stand firm for what they believe in. You got to be honest about what you believe in and stick with it. And that's what I believe, because you believe in yourself. Because we suffered so much, 5.5 to 8 years, we suffered so much. We don't fear suffering. We don't fear what's going to happen. We're just going to do the right thing. We're going to be honest. We're going to carry out our assignment. We're committed to, with character, courage, and commitment. Character, courage, and commitment. That's the anchor of our Engage with Honor model graphic. That's what I think. That's what I think people ought to do, is become more secure in themselves. They can refuse to do things that are not right and illegal, immoral, or unjust.
Colonel, I appreciate you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ted. I really appreciate it. We've got two questions that came through from LinkedIn. So the first one is from Bill Jewell, and he said, Colonel Ellis, were you at the Hanoi Hilton when Jane Fonda came through on her propaganda tour? If so, how did that affect you and the others?
Yes, I was in up there in the Chinese border, and we didn't have any electricity, and they brought a battery-powered recorder or radio there, and to listen to Hanoi Hannah talk about Jane Fonda being up there. And we just, I think we all believed that Jane Fonda was so insecure that she just kind of had to believe in something to go out and come to Hanoi and tell everybody she believed in them and how nice they were. And she went to anti-aircraft artillery and got her photo taken there. And she was just off base. I don't hate her anymore, and I never did, but she was just off base. We all believed that she was off base.
Well, thanks for answering that. The last question we have at the moment before we go to Jack is from Maggie. She says, "Sir, your story is so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing today. You said something I'm still thinking about. We got healthy physically and mentally. We knew if we didn't get healthy while we were in prison, we'd still be in prison when we got home." End quote. And she said, "It sounds like the whole group of 55 men came into agreement on this mindset. I'm curious to understand, how did the group collectively shift to this mindset? Was it a conscious decision that you discussed, or influenced by a few strong leaders, or did it just happen organically?"
It happened organically. We sometimes said we're looking forward to going home, and we want to be emotionally, mentally healthy when we go home. We don't want to go home with anger and bitterness. And we started shedding that every day against the communists. And sometimes somebody was angry at a roommate, cellmate, and we just learned to accept them, believe in them, look for something good in them, and believe in them. But most of our cellmates in the 55, and that we were really healthy, strong, and we hadn't been tortured as much, maybe, as some of the other cells. We were at Sante, and we were being tortured there, but uh, it may have been different. We just had a good teammates, and uh, we just accepted each other. We learned to accept each other as we are.
Yep.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna bring on Jack. Jack, it looks like you're muted on your end. There we go. And Jack is retired Major General from the Air Force. Is that right, Jack? Do I got it right?
That's correct.
And would love if you could get just a little bit of your background for folks that are listening in terms of where you came from and what you're doing now. And then I've got a question for you to tee up things with Lee.
Sure. Well, thanks, Chris. And hi, Lee. It's good to see you.
Hi. Good to see you, Jack.
How are you?
Good.
Good. So Jack Briggs, I spent about 30 plus years in the Air Force as a fighter pilot and as a commander of a variety of different units and organizations, culminating as the Director of Operations for U.S. Northern Command in Colorado Springs. After that, I took a kind of a detour from the military when I retired and got into higher education. Spent about 3 years at New York University before I took a little bit of a break and was the CEO and president of a gospel rescue mission in Colorado. And now I'm did that for about 4 years, and now I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor for Public Safety Operations at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I'm a big advocate for Lee. We've had the opportunity to share the stage. We also met at Leader Pass with Jamie Minton, and that's a great place to meet people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for joining. I'm curious. You've heard Lee's story a number of times. I'm curious if there's something new that jumped out at you this time or hit you in a different way about him or his narrative than has hit you before.
Yeah. I think I might take a detour from your question, but it's related.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the fact that what sets Lee apart from other coach, mentor, advisor, leadership trainers isn't just the fact that he has this POW experience, but it was how he operationalized it afterwards. That really, because he spent 5.5 years as a POW, he spent another career, if you will, back in the Air Force, where he retired as a colonel, was a commander. But then he has spent decades mentoring, coaching, training leaders. And if you haven't, those that are listening, if you haven't read one of his books, maybe you start with Engage with Honor or Leading with Honor. You're going to be introduced to his courageous accountability model. And he mentioned just a couple of things there. And I think that's what really stands out to me is that he transformed, and that was a question that Ted had, how do you continue to transform yourself? But he transformed that in a way that really, it sticks with me.
What part of that stuck with you, Jack?
Clarity. I'll ask you, okay? Clarity. Because I think that oftentimes we as leaders, we have it in our head, what we want to say and what we think is the right kind of place that we're going to go with the organization or with our own leadership. But when we try to articulate that, there are roadblocks to clarity. And so can you talk a little bit, maybe, obviously it was hard to be clear when you were communicating as a POW, but then as a leader, why is clarity so important?
In that clarity chapter, I read it a couple of days ago. You got to clarify at 100,000 feet as a leader. You got the big picture, okay? And then at 50,000 feet, this is a pilot thinking about it. At 50,000 feet, you got to clarify how this apply and what is the responsibility in our region here, in our area here. And then maybe 25,000 feet would be specifically for this leader, and then 5,000 feet might be and everybody and works for that leader. Okay, so everybody needs the big picture of what we're doing, what our goal is to accomplish, what our mission is, or what are we trying to do. And it helps them to have that, to think about that when they go home every day and when they come to work every day. But every leader in level at the next level down has to understand the clarity above and below.
Yeah, we as organizations, we're always, if you ever do a survey of an organization, one of the things that is almost a guarantee that people are going to say needs improvement is communication. There's always a need for more communication. When you found roadblocks to communicating as a POW, you obviously had to do novel workarounds to do that.
Yeah.
How did that translate then? How do you pull that into your leadership training now?
Well, we prioritized into what is essential. What do we need to share? The first thing was we need to share that we know you're here and what your shoot down date was and capture date and what your branch of service is and what your rank is. That was the first thing we found out. We memorized that from somebody we were in contact with. And the second thing what happened is a guy that's still alive. He's 89 now, but he was he was hanging up his pajamas. We wore pajamas back then, black pajamas or striped pajamas, and he'd washed it out and he was hanging up under my cell. And we had a window in the cell that's about 10 inches high and about 2 feet long, and it was covered with a rattan mat. It didn't have a glass in it. It was covered with a rattan mat. And he was over there under my window hanging up his clothes. And I jumped up and I said, and he said, "Hey, is anybody in there?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you know the code?" And I said, "The tap code." I said, "No." He says, "A 5x5 matrix. A is 1-1, B is 1-2." And this guard came over and hit him and dragged him away. But he passed us the code. And that was the most important thing back then. And so you got to think about, what is the most important thing I need to communicate to this person so they know their job and they know their responsibility, what I expect of them. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you've got to communicate with them more of what's going on around you, what's going to impact our responsibility. And then you got to let them know you care about them. They're important,
Yeah, I think when we want to communicate, sometimes there's this idea of over communicating being better than maybe focused communicating, which has those priorities. That's great. But let's talk flying for just a second, particularly formation flying, right? And one of the things I've heard you talk about before is your honor. And I know, and and other pilots who've flown formation know that you're always, it looks perfect, but it's not. You're always trying to correct back to perfect.
Exactly.
And you've made that analogy with honor. Could you speak to that just a little bit?
Yes. Every human being is one step away from being dishonorable, making a mistake. And so we've got to coach ourselves. We've got to remind ourselves. And when I am faced with something, that I'm emotionally engaged in and I want to do this, okay, I've got to coach myself, remind myself, back away from it and say, I need to go talk to somebody else that I trust, who believes in me, that I know, kind of a teammate or a boss, that somebody that will tell me, is this legitimate? Is this okay? And because when I'm emotionally involved in something, I may bend it a little bit, I'm going to do this. And that's the way human beings are. And you got to be aware of that and coach yourself every day. There was in the book Engage with Honor, and that's what the graphic is about, and that's clarify. And what was I going to say? Character, courage, and commitment. And you've got to emphasize that every day. And what was I going with that?
We were talking about honor and how we are always correcting back towards it.
Yes. And so I remind myself and I encourage others. Oh, I know what. In this book, the first chapter is about honor and about people who deviate from honor. And I at that point, when I was writing it, 5 former governors of states were in jail, and more than 60 mayors from across the United States were in jail. Okay. And so, and I talk about there's honor students in a county here in Georgia. There are honor students, 30% of them were cheating on the test. And they were taking some course online, and 30% of them were just cheating. And and they found out, the teacher found out and gave them, downgraded their scores because they were honor students, and downgraded them. And some of the parents complained about that. It's all one step away. And here in the city nearby, there was one person who was going to church every Sunday and worked for a Christian organization, nonprofit organization, and she embezzled almost $100,000 to treat her kids with some fine things, and she went to jail. And another who worked for the city, another person worked for the city, embezzled money. And a doctor that owned a doctor's, 2 or 3 doctors that had a doctor's surgeon group, and here, and we told one of the doctors that you probably need to check in on this guy because he's probably embezzling some money. He said, no, I'm not going to investigate that guy. He's a great guy. And a year later, 6 months later, he found out the guy was taking money. And so we're all one step away. And you got to coach yourself, and you got to have somebody that you can be accountable with that will tell you when you're stepping off the line. And coach yourself every day to get back in formation.
And try to do little, don't let yourself get too far away. Try to be making those initial changes right so you're making small ones. Chris, I know that we have just a few minutes left. I'll hand it back to you. But Lee, thanks again for everything. I have so much respect for you.
Jack, I've got one actually final question for you.
Oh.
I'm just curious if you can share a story of how Lee has impacted you.
Well,
on a personal level.
It started much well before Lee even knew I was alive, because I've always been a student of the POWs from Vietnam. There were about 500 POWs, but their impact in the military was long lasting, because when they came back, They help to strengthen the character of all of us. And then as a fighter pilot in the Air Force, having flown a lot of combat missions, their example was an example that if that were to happen to me, I would have tried to follow. Obviously, I thankfully was never in that situation, but that would have been something that I would have hearkened back to. And in our training, our survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training was based a lot on what they did.
And that was actually a question, Lee, that Bill Jewell had, is if you've participated in SEER schools or in lecturing in SEER schools.
I've been up there a couple of times, but they had another POW and then another POW there for a long time.
Yep.
To help them. Yeah.
Yep.
And they studied they interviewed some of us and, studied that and found out what we did and what we didn't do.
Gotcha. Well, thanks, Jack. I really appreciate it. I'm going to pop you off here and we'll wrap this up. Well, Lee, thank you so much. Do you have any parting shots? This has been just a phenomenal conversation, an amazing learning experience, and really grateful for you and your story, but curious if you have any parting shots.
Well, I'm an old man and I talk too much and too slow, and I've really enjoyed being on here, and I hope I've shared some good things, and I know that I've shared some things that are very important. Believing in yourself and helping others believe in themselves. And the great lessons from our POW leaders, that's what they did, They believed in us. They asked us if the senior officer was in a camp, was in cell with a young guy was 20 years younger than him, he would ask him for advice, and say, well, here's what I'm thinking about doing. Do you think this is good, plus or minus? And tell me what you think about it. And that was so important because they didn't have anybody else to ask. And it was something that we had never done before. They had never done before. They'd never led in a POW camp before. And they were leading there. And so they asked the young people what did they thought about it.
Well, thank you, Lee. I really appreciate it. I'm going to end the stream, and I'll just ask you to hang on for a minute while it's still uploading the file. But this has been an absolute gift. I know your story is going to bless a whole lot of people, as it already has.
Well, thank you, Chris. And I've just enjoyed being here.